welcome back to my channel. So I did a recent video about freedom from having a toxic relationship with my caregivers, but a lot of people enjoyed that, I think, and I got some positive comments from it and stuff. So I wanted to talk about this because I watched this channel recently by this girl called, I think she's called Danielle. She's called Danielle's Advocacy is her name on YouTube, but she talks about something that I've never heard of before, and I thought it was just like a really good thing to recognise. It's called Intrafamilial child torture, which is short for ICT. Well, the short meaning for that is ICT. And apparently it's categorised here as a longitudinal period of abuse categorised by caregivers by at least 2 physical assaults, 2 or more forms of psychological abuse, i.e. terrorising or isolating, resulting in prolonged suffering, permanent disfigurement, dysfunction or death. Also, neglect is always present and the deprivation is planned part of intentional cruelty. Family dynamics include desire for totalitarian control and intentional desire to break the will of and humanity of the child, and use of intense humanitarianism and terrorization. And also the difference apparently between the difference between family dynamics between physical abuse and child torture. So obviously physical abuse is not okay either, but it's one episode, for example, or like a few episodes of is physical abuse, like anger and loss of control, whereas child torture involves strategically planned acts of harm designed to establish the perpetrator's domination and control over the child's psyche, actions and access to necessities of life. So now I've read it the second time, I'm actually more 100% sure that I thought when I was listening to someone talk about this, which is where I found out about it, I was like, by the word intrafamilial, I thought it was to do with like generational trauma as well, which I think it can be part of it, obviously, just because a caregiver can physically assault or abuse a child doesn't mean that didn't happen to them, basically. And I think that is actually quite a common thing, especially for like physically violent parents, to be like, well, this is how I was brought up, this was how I was disciplined, you know. And the fact is, in school and stuff, they did used to validate things like ruling, which is absolutely bizarre to me. But they obviously don't do that now. I just wanted to talk about it because when you think about malignant narcissists, this is the first thing that just rings malignant narcissist when it says things like a strategically planned attack of cutting off a child's access to necessities and domination over the psyche and stuff like that. And this screams malignant narcissists to me, because malignant narcissists are high-level narcissists. They're usually, always high-level narcissists they basically are self-validated to the point where it's like they don't need the rest of the world to validate them to feel like they are the most perpetual bestest people. Well, they have to believe they're the best people in the world, and they completely like delude themselves for every second of every day about how great they are. And you know, it's like they're very abusive, because being a narcissist, you cannot see anyone else outside of yourself as as better than you, because you are to yourself as a malignant narcissist the best. So everything more or less is threatening to you. Being alone with yourself is very threatening to you, because you can see all your inadequacies. Do you know what I mean? And so that, to me, if you're dealing with intrafamilial child torture, is going to be primed place to have that. Do you know what I mean? Because I think it's something people need to start talking about, because you know, they only recently have I noticed how seriously sometimes, I don't honestly think, anyway, how seriously authorities can take child abuse. But the thing is, I always was under the impression that they didn't take, I think it really depends on case to case, to be honest with you. As a whole, there are laws against things like child abuse, but being the recipient of physical abuse, not massive amounts of it, but a little bit of physical abuse and ongoing psychological abuse, really chronic psychological, emotional abuse by my caregivers, and chronic neglect throughout my entire life to the point where I got mental health problems from it. And never having anyone really say anything or do anything about it, because I suppose they didn't know. I wasn't really how that manifested for me was not my parents are emotionally abusive to me. How the fuck was I going to know what they were doing? I just knew that I wasn't feeling good, and it manifested in mental health problems for me, eating disorders, depression, you know, that sort of thing. And it's not something that is easy to describe when you've got like malignant narcissists. If you know about narcissists, the thing about I suppose the fucker of things like childhood abuse is that I never learned about narcissists until I was like in my early 20s, and I'd had some unfortunate relationship issues. I never learned about narcissists until then, and you know, that was when I really started sort of understanding the patterns and stuff, and I started posting about it. I've got loads of shorts on narcissism, and there's a lot of information on narcissism in on the internet, luckily enough, and so I'm very good at understanding it now. And you do get spectrum narcissism, but it's hard sometimes because you get lots of narcissists that are so physically, emotionally, sexually, psychologically, emotionally abusive. Obviously, if you know anything about narcissism 101 is that they paint this pretty picture of everything is good and everything is, I'm the best parent, do you know what I mean? And it's easy to perpetuate that when A, a child has no idea what the fuck is going on, B, you know, you've got like some of their needs being met in terms of like they can be being fed, you know, through like conditional like means. It's like if you do a part of child I'm going to call it ICT because I don't want to keep saying the same thing. The part of ICT apparently is like enforcing unjustified punishment and like chores when it's not necessary. Like chores, like something clicked in me this morning, whereas like I have talked about before the fact that I may or may not have ADHD and I'm getting a diagnosis for it currently. Should I have it? I think I do have ADHD. Even though it kind of comes and goes. Recently it's not been as bad, but I think overall I probably do have it. And it's one of those things where I think on top of having those symptoms, like you can't ignore the trauma that comes behind and alongside things like neurological, you know, neurodivergence. But I do think that a lot of my resistance towards like keeping a clean house and stuff has been because I've sort of had forced chores. Like it was like, oh, I'll pay you like a few pounds, like basically next to nothing, for like 2 hours work, you know, and it's basically like, you know, it sounds like pocket money, but I would question whether like your like minimum wage at the end of the day is like £11. Do you know what I mean? You know, maybe back when I was doing it, the minimum wage was a little bit lower. But it's a case of like, they'll work you to the absolute bone. They'll pick apart, if you're dealing with narcissists, they'll use it as an excuse to pick apart everything you're doing. I was told again and again and again and again, and it really clicked us to, in narcissism, why this makes sense. Because they don't see anything outside of themselves as being good enough. They're like, oh, no one does anything as good as me. Have you ever heard like a narcissistic mother? I feel like it's quite a common thing to hear of, like, you know, no one does anything as good as me, I have to do everything around the house, no one does it properly, and blah, blah, blah. But that is narcissism, because it's like, I'm not being funny, if my child was to do something when they're a child and they're not actually supposed to be doing stuff, but yet they make an attempt at cleaning dishes for me or something, I'd be like, oh wow, like, you know, thank you so much, or please don't do that. I'd probably be like, please don't do that. If I want them to not do that, I'd be like, let me do the adult work, you focus on being a child. Do you know what I mean? But narcissists will use these sort of tactics, it's so insidious, as a way to break down a child's self-esteem and set them up in adulthood to not feel like they are able to successfully complete day-to-day tasks that every adult should and has to do. Do you know what I mean? Things like cleaning your clothes, keeping a clean house, keeping, you know, stuff like that. Do you know what I mean? They will pick apart these things. And it is torture. It's complete torture, because they are creating and it sounds so innocent, that's why it's so insidious. It's like, oh, they're only doing pocket money, you know what I mean? But it's like, no, it's so deeply insidious. When you've got narcissism, they'll set the standards way higher than any child should have to get to in the first place, like to the point of ridiculously high, to the point, that's what narcissism is. They set standards so high that you can't reach them because they're unattainable, and you're inevitably going to fail, and you'll spend hours cleaning, whatever, to gain this money, which is probably not half of what you should be getting. And even if it is enough to make minimum wage, you'll only know that your work is going to be picked apart not to the standard that child should have to work for. Do you know what I mean? Or like, it's chronic for parents as well to say, oh, until you've done your chores, you can't have this or that or the other. And it sounds very innocent, but to be honest with you, it's not, because think about all the shit a child has to do. They have to go to school, they have to clean themselves, they have to do this and that and the other, they're growing, they're small, do you know what I mean? The last thing they need to be having as well on their plate is people parentify children, adults, they parentify children to the point where it's horrible and it's disgusting, and it's unnecessary and it's completely abusive in entirety, and you know, it's horrible, but that in itself is like an adult giving a child responsibilities that they should not be having, which sets them up in adulthood. As I've said already before, it gave me mental health problems, because no child should be under that amount of pressure to parent themselves. Oh, and their siblings as well. I'm sure I parented my sibling, because they are too dysregulated. I heard it recently, even medium level narcissists, they're too dysregulated to even see you. Do you know what I mean? They can't see you. Like, they won't see you because it triggers their inadequacy, but they're so busy managing their own shit, they just don't see you. Do you know what I mean? And when you look at high level narcissists, they're way too busy trying to just not hit out at everyone, or they do hit out at everyone. They're too busy hitting out at everyone to recognise what the fuck they're doing. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, what was the other thing? So physical abuse, obviously never good. What's terrorising and isolating? Yes, it's tricky because it's insidious, and as I say, it's a way to describe, other than just having malignant and highly narcissistic parents and having abuse that can be described through things like physical abuse, things like psychological abuse. It's a concept which I really like, because it properly it defines it as torture, because it's hard even when you've picked back the layers of, oh, this parent, it's not all as it seems, this parent is not the perfect rainbow flower bearing, you know, fucking, you know, light of whatever they think they are. They're terribly abusive, and they, behind closed doors, are an absolute travesty and a fucking hot mess. And it's disgusting, and it's completely not up to the standard that any parent should be. And also, And also, and so then there's that one way of explaining it, but also when you've got the psychological aspect and the terrorization of that as well that's brought into it in the isolation, you know, and that's all narcissism really. But it gives definition to the word in the word torture, which I do really like, because it really properly depicts how it is. Because I think even then you can sort of say, well, they met my basic needs, you know, they obviously have a personality disorder, but they were still parent. You know, I don't consider my parents parents. The people that I grew up in the household with, I don't define them as parents in my head, because they didn't do enough to parent me to be deemed the word parent. To me, they're abusers and they're not parents. And any parents I've had of God is my parent. The snippets of information I've seen on what healthy parenting looks like, I've pieced that together and brought it back to myself, just by what I've seen. And you know, you're copying all this shit, besides being messed up by seeing that dysfunction, but it defines it as categorically, basically, like they talk about borderlines, like removing your legs so that you can't walk. But it's not like that. It's literally premeditated abuse, to the point that, you know, it's planned out. Do you know what I mean? A borderline won't plan out abuse on someone. I can't, you know, it doesn't fully encapsulate what I experienced to say that my parent has had borderline traits. I have borderline traits. I wouldn't premeditate abuse on someone. You know, it's not the same thing. You know, it's planned, categorized. Whether it's conscious or not, they still physically did it. I think it is conscious though. It's consciously, I want my child to suffer. I do not want them to succeed. I want them to have perceived power over them psychologically, and that is what their conscious choice is, and that is extreme abuse, and it's torture. Do you know what I mean? And then you've got these people growing up. Luckily, there is good access to services that I've seen, because I've seen them and been in them myself. But you know, I'm grateful to have had that exposure to services. But I see people left, right, and centre that have clearly had this level of abuse to one degree or another, and they're not even aware of it, because it's so easily marginalised, and it's so easy. Oh well, you know, they're middle class. So what if they're middle class? Why does class have anything to do with how you parent your children? Do you know what I mean? Yes, you've got a level of money. Why the fuck society validates the more? I understand why they validate people with more money. It's so you've not got as many money worries. But it's not just about your money. Your money really doesn't have a great massive amount of correlation to how you treat a child. And as I say, this is more for anyone to look at this and think, oh my god, maybe I had that. Do you know what I mean? Because it really makes you hold more compassion for yourself. Because it's one thing to say, oh, I've developed mental health problems. You don't give them much accountability. Oh, they're a narcissist. Oh, you give them a bit more accountability. Oh, a lot of what they've done as narcissists and the abuse that I've experienced in the ways that I was not built, my car was not built in that way, give them a bit more responsibility. But then when you start to think, oh, I actually experienced torture, it's like someone gets taken off and tortured in the middle of, you know, some random country in some back bloody end of God only knows where. That's torture. But what is also torture is having it happen from a caregiver. Do you know what I mean? It makes absolutely no difference as to whether you're kidnapped at birth and tortured somewhere else. Yes, the means of torture can be different if you're outside, but this torture happens within the household within the household experience. Do you know what I mean? And that's what's more insidious than that. It's absolutely awful, and it's just about giving credit where credit's due, because if shit isn't seen, then it won't be worked on. You know what I mean? And this stuff will perpetuate, it will manifest through recording, he knows how mental health, issues with substance abuse, social issues, behavioural issues, stuff like that. And people just won't have their shit together and they won't heal because they'll minimise the genuine torture that they experience. Because it's one thing to have a narcissistic parent and have no contact. It's nothing to heal. It's nothing to genuinely be a survivor of torture and to have to heal from that. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of psychological and space you need to hold for yourself when you've experienced something like that. And categorically, I have experienced that. Reading those definitions, categorically yes. And anyone who has had a caregiver that's a malignant narcissist has probably had the same. My camera's on 1%, but I hope this reached someone, and I think if it's viewable enough, I deem it viewable enough, I want to post it because people did like my Freedom from My Toxic Family video. It is kind of deep. I think it's one of those things which I hope gets talked about more, because yes, it was good for me to hear about. But yeah, thanks for listening.